Life on my ranch had always been the sort of steady rhythm most folks dream about but rarely experience. Out here, time seemed to move differently. Days began with the soft glow of sunrise spilling across the rolling fields, painting the tall grass in shades of gold. The roosters always knew their cue, crowing just as the mist lifted from the low ground. The air carried that earthy scent of soil mixed with dew, and the sound of cattle shifting in the pasture reminded me that the world didn't need much more than a good piece of land and quiet work to make sense. For years, that ranch was a refuge from noise and nonsense. I had carved out a life rooted in peace. My neighbors were miles away, and the only traffic came in the form of deer slipping through the trees or the occasional hawk tracing lazy circles overhead. I tended the land, fixed what broke, and leaned into the kind of solitude that teaches a man patience. When storms rolled through, I watched them like a stage play from my porch, knowing the land had seen worse. When seasons shifted, I marked them by the smell of cut hay, the crunch of frost, or the return of fireflies. This rhythm, this harmony between man and land was why I stayed put. The outside world, with its endless noise and rules, felt like a distant thing. My boundaries were clear: a gravel driveway, a stretch of fencing that curved along the pasture, and a private sign marking that the land beyond belonged to me, and no one else. That sign wasn't meant to be hostile, it was just a reminder that my little world operated on its own terms. But peace, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It can be shattered not by storms or droughts, but by people who can't understand the value of leaving well enough alone. The first signs came slowly. At first, it was nothing more than a pair of tire tracks pressed into the gravel road that cut across the edge of my property. I thought little of it. Maybe some hunter took a wrong turn, or maybe a lost driver had swung around to turn back. But then the tracks multiplied. The gravel grew scattered. The edges kicked out wider than before. It was as if my quiet entrance had suddenly become a thoroughfare. What unsettled me wasn't just the tracks, but the trash that followed. Empty cups, crumpled receipts, a soda can glinting beneath the fence line, things that had no place on my ranch. They stood out like weeds in a tilled field, ugly reminders that someone was passing through who didn't belong. I cleaned them up, grumbling to myself but thinking little of it beyond mild annoyance. Then one evening, just as the last of the light was fading, I noticed a lineup of cars idling at the far edge of my pasture. Headlights cut across the grass like unwelcome search beams, and engines hummed against the stillness that usually owned the night. I watched from my porch, heart sinking with the realization that my quiet ranch was no longer invisible. It didn't take long to piece together what was happening. Word had spread somewhere. Somebody had decided that my wide-open land made for convenient overflow parking. Folks from town had started to treat my ranch like a public lot, a free stretch of ground for their gatherings, events, or whatever business they had nearby. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had moved to this land for solitude, for the very absence of people, and now strangers were carving ruts into my fields, with no thought beyond their own convenience. The next days confirmed my fears. More cars appeared, each set of tires chewing deeper into the dirt, leaving scars in places where grass had once grown thick. My fence line became a casual border, ignored rather than respected. Some vehicles pressed so close that my cattle stirred, uneasy, shifting away from the lights and noise. It wasn't just disruption, it was intrusion. The kind that cut straight through the soul of a man who thought he'd bought peace with his hard-earned money. The strangest part was how entitled it all felt. These weren't random wanderers or desperate travelers. The cars were shiny, polished, the kind you'd expect in a suburban driveway, not out here on a rural back road. They parked in neat rows, almost as if someone had organized them. And soon enough, I realized someone had. That was when I heard whispers of an HOA from a nearby subdivision. A few miles down the main road, a new development had sprung up, their cookie-cutter houses lined in perfect rows, lawns trimmed to an exactness that only comes from strict rules and fines. They had their own community events, their pool parties, and their board meetings. Apparently, their lots weren't big enough to hold the sea of cars that came with their social gatherings. So, in their minds, the solution was simple. My ranch, wide open and unprotected, had been claimed as their overflow. To them, it was just a patch of empty land. To me, it was home. I'd spent years keeping that ranch the way it was meant to be, wild in places, orderly in others, always balanced. The soil was familiar beneath my boots. The fences were strewn by my own hands, and every path across it was marked by memory. It wasn't just land, it was the foundation of a life. And yet, here it was, reduced in the eyes of strangers to a pod. A life to a kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. It's a log to live score spouse, and lives a laws of may slide consider. It was May to see salai to lies may skis. My ples was conwide alive, may se callous. It's concede, mace to subaduf, kamide. Made side, it is kakub, it's it, a sev it, to it's a con. Get it, kale sak, you say da bika kit, we only skriek I de mela, sitik you kik, we side it, cause it abides, it bit is subsect, we said the look to this free parking lot, as though the sweat and care I'd poured into it held no value at all. The invasion changed the air around the ranch. Where there had once been silence, there was now the echo of car doors slamming and music drifting from rolled-down windows. Where there had been starlight, there were now headlights. Animals shifted nervously at the disturbance, their instincts sharper than mine. Even the night itself seemed uneasy, its stillness broken in a way that couldn't be repaired by simply picking up trash or smoothing the ruts. I realized then that the boundary between peace and chaos was thinner than I'd ever believed. For years, I had trusted that the world beyond my fence would respect the sign that said private. But the HOA wasn't made up of people who lived by respect. They lived by rules of their own making, and when their rules ran short, they simply reached out and took what wasn't theirs. The shift in my world wasn't just physical, it was personal. I felt the violation deep down, like a weight in my chest. Every tire track was a reminder that my solitude had been stolen. Every scrap of litter, a sign that my peace was no longer mine alone. The land had been my shield, my sanctuary, and now strangers had cracked it open without so much as a thought. And as I stood on my porch one evening, watching yet another row of cars spill across my pasture, I understood something clearly. This wasn't going to stop on its own. What had been shattered couldn't be put back together with patience or silence. My quiet life had been trespassed upon, and sooner or later, I'd have to find a way to reclaim it. Because peace, once lost, isn't given back, Kit has to be taken. The more I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a few inconsiderate neighbors wandering onto land they didn't own. This was organized, deliberate, and, in its own way, brazen. The rows of cars weren't random. They were lined up neatly, as though someone had directed traffic. There was order in the chaos. A kind of smug efficiency that told me this wasn't accidental misuse. It was planned. It was one thing to have strangers blundering onto my property. It was another to see that it was being treated like an extension of some suburban development I had no part of. I started noticing the same faces, people who strutted about as if they had a right to be there. They carried themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from backing, from knowing there was a group behind them. They weren't sneaking around like trespassers. No, They acted as if they were entitled guests, stepping onto a piece of land they thought was theirs to claim. At first, I tried to make sense of it. How could a homeowners association, a group I had no membership in, decide my ranch was fair game? Their subdivision was more than a mile down the road, tucked behind tidy hedges and glossy signs with cursive lettering. It was a place built on control rules about mailbox sizes, lawn heights, and even what color curtains you could hang. The kind of environment I'd avoided on purpose, because I'd learned long ago that the pursuit of order often came at the cost of freedom. But apparently, freedom was not something the HOA respected. When their tiny neighborhood proved too small for their ambitions, they simply stretched their borders into places they didn't own. My ranch, with its wide pastures and flat ground, was nothing more than an answer to their problem. Not enough room for their cars. It was a strange feeling, realizing you were being written into someone else's rulebook without your consent. I was no member of their HOA. I had never agreed to their meetings, their fees, their bylaws. Yet here I was, forced into their orbit. They acted like their declaration was enough to turn private property into community property. My fence, my posted signs, my rights as an owner, none of it mattered. In their minds, they had claimed it, and that was enough. Soon, I started noticing little signs of permanence. What had begun as casual overflow parking was shifting into something more deliberate. Orange cones were set up at the edge of my gravel driveway as though someone had been directing the cars. Tire tracks grew deeper, the ground pressed flat from repeated use. Even the trash evolved, no longer just stray cups, but food containers stacked as though people had picnicked there. It was no longer just use, it was occupation. That's when the truth of their claim started to seep in. The HOA wasn't just borrowing space, they believed they had a right to it. Whispers reached me from town. A few HOA members had spoken openly at meetings about neighboring land being designated for parking. Designated as though their board had authority over property lines. Their language made it sound official, as though my ranch had somehow become subject to their jurisdiction. The arrogance of it was staggering. To them, land wasn't about ownership or rights. It was about use, convenience, and the belief that their group's decisions outweighed the individual. And because they were a unit aboard, a collective, they thought their word carried more weight than mine. The boldest insult came one afternoon when I returned from checking fences on the far side of the property. At the entrance of my driveway, hammered into the ground, stood a temporary sign that hadn't been there before. It bore the HOA's logo slick and suburban, and below it, neatly printed, were the words, "Event Parking." That sign drove the point home. They weren't just using my land, they were branding it, stamping it with their insignia as though it belonged to them. The subdivision might have been miles away, but their reach had extended into my front yard. Their rules bleeding into a place they had no claim to. It was a declaration of ownership without purchase, a theft disguised as organization. The damage to my land worsened. Grass that had once been thick and green now lay pressed into ruts, the soil scarred and uneven. Sections of the pasture nearest the fence were worn down to bare earth, patches of dust where nothing would grow for months. My animals grew restless, their patterns disrupted by the sudden influx of noise and movement. The ranch, once steady and dependable, now carried the air of disruption. It no longer felt like refuge, it felt invaded. What struck me most wasn't just the physical harm, but the sheer gall of their actions. They had built a community around rules, yet here they were, breaking the most fundamental one: respect for property. They fined their own members for weeds and paint colors. But when it came to my land, they behaved as though fences and signs didn't exist. Their authority ended at the edge of their subdivision, but they acted as though it extended as far as they wished it to go. And what could I do? Call the sheriff. Out here, law enforcement was slow, and by the time anyone showed up, the cars would be gone. The damage already done. Stand at the driveway and block them myself. That would turn into confrontation, the kind that escalates faster than it resolves. Every option felt like trying to hold back a river with bare hands. The HOA wasn't just a person, was a machine. A group that moved in numbers, backed by paperwork and confidence. Yet as much as their bold claim angered me, it also sharpened something inside me. There's a point where violation breeds clarity, where the loss of peace transforms into a kind of focus. I began to see the HOA not just as a nuisance, but as a threat to the very life I had built. They weren't simply parking cars. They were planting their flag on land I had worked for, cared for, and lived on. It was theft, dressed as entitlement, and the longer it went on, the clearer it became that waiting for them to realize their error was useless. They weren't going to stop. They had convinced themselves that my ranch was theirs to use, and once people believe something belongs to them, prying it back takes more than words. Every evening, as the sun went down and the headlights reappeared, I felt the quiet anger grow. The HOA had made their claim loud and clear. My ranch was, in their minds, nothing more than a public parking lot. But in making that claim, they had also made a mistake. They had underestimated the one thing they couldn't regulate or organize: the resolve of a man who knew what was his and wasn't about to give it up. Once the HOA staked its claim, I knew I couldn't sit silent. A man's patience might run long, but it isn't endless. And though I've always believed in handling things with a steady hand rather than a heavy one, there comes a point when you have to step forward and try to set things right. So, I started with the simplest gesture: reminders. I made new signs, larger than before, painted bold in red letters that left no room for interpretation. Private property, no trespassing. I hammered them into the ground along the fence line and at the entrance of my driveway. The wood was fresh, the paint sharp, the kind of message no one could miss. I thought surely this would at least make a few people hesitate. Surely it would remind them that this wasn't just open ground for the taking. But it didn't. The first night, after I put them up, the cars returned as if the signs weren't even there. Their headlights swept over the boards, their tires rolled past without pause. By the next morning, one of the signs had been tipped over. The post snapped clean as though someone had deliberately pushed it aside. Another had been tagged with spray paint, the bright letters drowned out by crude markings. It was as if the very act of declaring my ownership had provoked them, as though the HOA had taken offense at the idea that their authority might be challenged. Still, I pressed on. I thought maybe it was a matter of communication, that perhaps the HOA hadn't grasped the reality that my land wasn't theirs. I sent letters, plain, direct notes addressed to the HOA board. In them, I explained my boundaries, laid out the damage their use had caused, and asked, respectfully, for them to stop. I mailed copies, hand-delivered one to their office, even pinned one to the event parking sign. They had staked on my driveway. The silence that followed was louder than any response. Not a word came back, no acknowledgement, no apology. And yet the cars continued to arrive, more now than before, as though my request had only fueled their determination. Some evenings, it looked less like parking and more like a parade, lines of cars stretching down my fence, their engines humming, their drivers chatting as they crossed into land that wasn't theirs. It became clear then that the HOA wasn't ignoring me by accident. They were ignoring me on purpose. My efforts at peace weren't seen as goodwill. They were seen as weakness. In their eyes, if I had to ask for respect, then I must not have the power to demand it. The more I tried, the bolder they became. Where before they had left trash scattered, now they dumped entire bags. Where before they parked in the field, now they pulled closer to my barn, edging into spaces that were never meant for vehicles. One morning, I found ruts so deep they had sliced through a stretch of irrigation pipe, leaving water pooling into the soil. Another time, I discovered one of my gates unlatched, a gap wide enough that a calf had slipped out before I caught it. It wasn't just disrespect anymore, it was damage, real and costly. I even tried to meet them face to face. One Saturday, when I saw the familiar wave of headlights streaming in, I positioned myself at the driveway entrance. I thought maybe, if I stood there plainly, people would understand. A man doesn't block his own land without reason. But the cars slowed only briefly before maneuvering around me, tires crunching the edges of the ditch to bypass the point I had tried to make. Not a window rolled down, not a head turned. They just acted as though I was invisible. That night, I stood in the dark and watched rows of vehicles fill my field. Music spilled faintly through the air, the thud of bass mixing with the chirp of crickets. I felt like a stranger on my own property, exiled by the very people trespassing upon it. Each attempt I had made to reclaim peace had been twisted into failure. And with every failure, the HOA grew bolder, their grip tightening on something that was never theirs to begin with. The weight of it settled heavy on me. For years, my ranch had been a place of balance. Work was met with reward. Effort was met with result. But now, effort only bred insult. My signs were broken, my letters ignored, my presence bypassed. The more I tried to handle things with calm, the more they mistook it for surrender. And the damage wasn't just physical anymore. It seeped into the very rhythm of my days, where I once woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of dew. I now woke to the sight of tire ruts and litter. Where evenings once meant watching the horizon darken into a quiet night, they now meant bracing myself for the flood of headlights. My peace had been replaced by vigilance, my calm by frustration. I had thought that appealing to reason might work that reminders, letters, even my own presence would be enough. But reason has no place where entitlement thrives. The HOA wasn't looking for fairness. They weren't even looking for compromise. They were looking for control. And as long as I played by the rules of patience, they would keep twisting those rules against me. Every attempt at peace had backfired. My signs had been destroyed. My words had been ignored. My land had been violated even further. There comes a point when a man realizes he's standing in a fight he never asked for, one that won't end by waiting or wishing. I stood on my porch one evening, looking out over the headlights gleaming in my pasture, and felt the last threads of patience slip away. The HOA had pushed me past the line. I had tried every peaceful way I knew, and it had only fed their arrogance. And so, beneath the quiet stars, with the hum of trespassing engines filling the night, I understood what had to come next. If peace couldn't be asked for, it would have to be taken back. Not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through resolve. The HOA had mistaken patience for weakness, but they were about to learn the difference. Because when peace backfires, what follows isn't surrender, it's preparation. The moment I accepted that peace would never return on its own, my mind began to sharpen in ways it hadn't in years. There's a clarity that comes when patience burns off like fog, leaving only the bones of determination behind. I knew I couldn't match the HOA in numbers, and I had no interest in meeting their arrogance with shouting matches in the driveway. That wasn't my style. Out here, the land itself has a way of providing answers if you're willing to listen. I started by studying the problem the same way I'd study a broken fence or a flooded pasture. The HOA's strength lay in organization. They moved as a unit, arriving in groups, acting as though my field was already theirs. Their weakness, though, was assumption. They assumed I'd never push back. They assumed my ranch was just empty space, sitting idle, waiting to be used. They assumed wrong. The first step was observation. For weeks, I took note of their patterns. Cars came in waves, heavy on weekends, lighter on weekdays. They parked in neat rows, always favoring the same section of the pasture closest to the road. By the time the sun went down, the area looked like a small dealership, headlights flashing as latecomers joined in. I noticed how they always entered from the same point, my gravel driveway, funneling through without a second thought. It was a habit, and habits can be turned against you. The damage they caused became part of my plan. The ruts in the soil, the patches of worn grass, the tire-slicked mud after rain, all of it told me exactly where they'd go, exactly how they'd treat the land. Every scar they left was a map, and I began to see the layout of their intrusion as clearly as if they'd drawn it for me. If they wanted to treat my ranch like a parking lot, then I'd simply let it behave like one, but on my terms. I started quietly, with work that looked ordinary to anyone passing by. On mornings when the air was still cool, I'd haul supplies out to the edge of the field, lengths of heavy chain, steel stakes, and rolls of fencing wire. I dug posts deep into the ground, setting them at angles where only I knew they'd serve a purpose. From a distance, it looked like ranch maintenance, the kind of labor I did every season. But in truth, it was preparation. Then came the water. The land out here has its own memory. I knew exactly where the low spots were, those places that collect rain and turn slick under weight. With a little effort, I redirected runoff from my irrigation ditches, guiding it toward the sections where the cars liked to gather. A steady trickle was all it took. By day, the soil looked firm. By night, when the weight of vehicles pressed down, it would sink into mud. I knew what would happen to tires in that kind of ground. I also turned to something simpler: barriers. Not the kind meant to keep out cattle or mark a fence line, but subtle obstructions. A stretch of chain across a gap, low enough to miss in headlights. A trench dug shallow but wide, hidden by grass. They weren't traps, they were reminders. Any driver too careless to pay attention would soon learn that my land wasn't built to serve their convenience. And then, so final stroke: documentation. I invested in a set of trail cameras, the kind hunters use to track deer. I mounted them high, out of reach, camouflaged among branches. Each night, they clicked silently, capturing image after image of license plates, faces, and the endless line of vehicles trespassing across my pasture. Where words had failed, proof would speak louder. It wasn't revenge I sought, it was balance. I didn't want to fight. I wanted resolution. But resolution sometimes requires a little discomfort, and the HOA had made themselves deaf to any language. But consequence. So, I let the land do the talking. The first weekend after I finished my preparations, the pattern played out as expected. Cars streamed in, headlights cutting through the dusk, rolling over the same ground they always had. At first, nothing seemed different. They parked in their neat rows, chatting and laughing as though my ranch were theirs. But, as the evening deepened, the consequences began to unfold. Engines revved harder than usual as tires spun against mud that hadn't been there before. Ruts deepened quickly, swallowing wheels until some vehicles sat angled and stuck. Drivers stepped out, shoes sinking into the soft ground, muttering as they tried to push their cars free. Headlights flashed in frantic bursts as more cars arrived and found themselves blocked by the mess ahead. The once neat parking rows turned into chaos, vehicles sliding sideways, horns blaring as frustration grew. Meanwhile, my trail cameras blinked, quietly recording every moment. License plates gleamed under the flash, faces twisted in anger or panic. What had been an invisible crime was now etched permanently into memory cards. By the time the night ended, my pasture looked like a battlefield. Mud stretched deep where the cars had floundered, patches of grass torn away entirely. A few vehicles had been abandoned until morning. their owners too frustrated to pull them free. And in the middle of it all, the HOA's precious event. Parking sign lay half submerged in muck, a symbol of their arrogance sinking into the very ground they had trespassed on. But my plan wasn't finished. The next day, I gathered the photos and videos from my cameras, neatly labeled and time-stamped. I filed them with the county sheriff's office, along with a detailed account of the damages. I wasn't naive enough to think law enforcement would camp out at my gate, but the paper trail mattered. It was evidence, a counterweight to their entitlement. If the HOA wanted to treat me like one of their members, I would respond with the kind of record they couldn't ignore. And word began to spread. Those who had been stuck in the mud shared their frustration, not with me, but with each other. Complaints buzzed through the subdivision. Anger directed not at the landowner they'd wronged, but at their own HOA board for leading them into a mess. The same confidence that had fueled their arrogance now cracked under the weight of inconvenience. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected the land to push back. As I stood at the edge of the field, surveying the wreckage, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The damage to my land was still there, yes, but so was the message. My ranch wasn't theirs. It never had been, and no sign or meeting or smug assumption could make it so. The plan had worked. Without raising my voice, without throwing a punch, I had reminded them of a truth as old as the soil itself. A man's land is his own, and if you trespass long enough, the ground will rise up to meet you. The morning after the HOA's cars had turned my pasture into a bog, I walked the field in slow, measured steps. The air was heavy with the smell of churned mud and gasoline, a far cry from the clean, earthy scent I was used to. The ruts were deep enough to swallow my boots, wide trenches carved by tires that had spun themselves hopeless. Abandoned bottles, fast food wrappers, even a discarded shoe dotted the field like evidence of a careless invasion. But I didn't feel anger in that moment. What I felt was certainty. The HOA had taken from me, over and over, with their arrogance and their willful disregard. Now, for the first time, they would be forced to give something back. I gathered the images from my trail cameras, hundreds of snapshots of plates, faces, and vehicles. Some were caught mid-rev, tires spewing mud like fireworks. Others showed entire rows of cars lined neatly under the event parking sign. Proof that this wasn't random trespassing, it was organized misuse. Each photograph was a nail in the coffin of their denial. The sheriff's office had heard my complaints before, but without proof, it was always the same shrug. This time was different. I walked in with stacks of photos, video files on a thumb drive, and a written account of the damage measured, documented, undeniable. The deputy flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each image. By the end, he didn't need convincing. What I had brought was enough to escalate the matter from nuisance to legal violation. Soon, the county sent an inspector. I met him at the pasture where the ground still bore the scars of the weekend's chaos. He paced slowly, clipboard in hand, jotting down every rut, every broken pipe, every fence post knocked askew. His boots sank in the same mud that had trapped the cars, and I could see in his eyes the recognition that this wasn't a trivial matter. It was property damage substantial, deliberate, and costly. Word spread quickly in town. People loved to talk, and the sight of tow trucks hauling stranded vehicles out of my pasture was too juicy a tale to keep quiet. Stories twisted their way back to the subdivision, and soon enough, the HOA's polished image began to crack. Their members, once so confident in their entitlement, now found themselves grumbling at board meetings. Angry not at me, but at the leaders who had led them into such a mess. The same organization that prided itself on control was unraveling under its own arrogance. The county sent the bill for damages not to me, but directly to the HOA, Every inch of ruined pasture, every broken pipe, every repair I had to make it, was all itemized, signed, and stamped with legal authority. For once, it wasn't my word against theirs. It was law against arrogance. The numbers weren't small. Repairing the irrigation alone came at a steep price. Resurfacing the pasture would take time and money. Fencing would need to be replaced. Posts redug, the ground reseeded to restore what they had destroyed. The HOA, flush with fines from its own members but unprepared for the consequences of its overreach, suddenly faced costs it couldn't brush aside. They had to answer for every rut, every tire mark, every insult they had carved into my land. But money wasn't the only consequence. Along with the financial penalty came restriction. The sheriff's office issued warnings to individuals caught on camera, citing them for trespassing. Patrol cars began circling the area on event nights, a visible reminder that the county was watching now. And the HOA, once smug in its control, was forced to post its own signs, not the ones claiming my ranch as parking, but ones warning its residents not to set foot on it again. For the first time in months, the pasture stood quiet at night. No headlights swept across the grass. No engines hummed in the distance. The silence returned, heavy and satisfying, like a long drought broken by steady rain. My animals grazed in peace again, no longer spooked by the flood of strangers. The ranch breathed easier, and so did I, standing at the edge of the field. I looked out at the scars that still lingered and felt a mix of relief and reflection. The damage would take time to heal, but the land was resilient. Grass would return. Ruts would fade, and the soil would reclaim its balance. What mattered was that the intrusion had ended, not because I shouted louder than them, but because I let the truth of ownership and consequence speak for itself. The HOA had thought they could stretch their reach endlessly, that their rules and arrogance extended beyond their neat little fences. They had mistaken patience for surrender, kindness for weakness. But in the end, they learned a lesson older than any set of bylaws. You can't take what isn't yours without paying for it. As weeks passed, I heard more about the fallout in their subdivision. Residents angry at rising fees, board members bickering over who had authorized the event parking, meetings turning sour as blame shifted from one to another. The same arrogance that had brought them to my land now corroded their unity. Their control, once so tight, unraveled in the face of accountability. I didn't gloat, though the temptation was there. Out here, life teaches you that pride can undo a man faster than failure. Instead, I let the satisfaction settle quietly, the way rain settles into thirsty soil. Justice had been served, not with fists or fury, but with patience, preparation, and proof. The ranch returned to what it had always been, a place of work, of peace, of steady rhythms. Sunrises came golden again, unbroken by the glare of headlights. Evenings softened into crickets and wind instead of car doors and chatter. The signs I had hammered into the ground still stood, but now they were respected. The fence line was once again a boundary, not a suggestion, and every so often, when I'd walk the field and see the faint lines where ruts had once cut deep, I'd remember the lesson myself. Peace isn't something you can assume will last forever. It's something you guard, something you tend, the same way you mend fences and care for soil. And when it's threatened, you don't always need to fight with noise, you just need to be smarter, steadier, and more rooted than the ones trying to take it. The HOA had tried to turn my private ranch into public parking. They thought their collective will was stronger than my individual right. But in the end, they paid for it literally and figuratively, and I returned to my porch, to my fields, to the quiet that had always been mine, with the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge is simply living in peace once the noise has finally been silenced.